This episode is being brought to you in part by Veeva Systems. Veeva connects patients, sites, and sponsors on a single technology ecosystem to make clinical trials easier and faster. You guys are probably sick of hearing me talk about Veeva Site Vault, but frankly, it's been a huge addition for us in making our regulatory process simpler, more efficient. And it's helped us get rid of all these ridiculous paper binders that I absolutely hate. So I appreciate that very much. Veeva Site Vault gives research sites one place to work with sponsors, reduces the total number of systems and logins used to run clinical trials. There are already more than 4,500 sites using Site Vault. More than 400 industry sponsors use Veeva clinical applications. It's pretty insane, but 65% of all global clinical trials already run on Veeva. The best part is Site Vault is completely free for sites to use, which we know is a pain point for a lot of systems out there. So don't take my word for it. Go check it out. Go to sites.veeva.com today and learn more about Veeva Site Vault. This episode is also being brought to you in part by Real-Time CTMS, a leading provider of innovative software solutions for clinical trial research, sites, site network sponsors, and CROs. Look, really, as a site, we would be lost without Real-Time CTMS. It allows us to keep up with our invoicing, stay within windows for our patients, compensate our patients. It does so much, and the customer service at Real-Time is second to none. So make sure you check them out, get a free demo, visit the company's website at realtime-ctms.com and complete one of their contact forms. Hello and welcome to the Note to File podcast, a collection of interviews, best practices, and candid commentary for clinical research sites. I'm your host, Brad Hightower. Today we have the return of Ethan Seville. Ethan had an early episode on the podcast, so make sure you go check that out. But Ethan's worked across a wide range of indications, across various roles such as patient recruitment, coordinating, quality assurance management, and regulatory. He's now the manager of customer engagement and strategic solutions at Slope.io, which helps researchers by ensuring their network of clinical trial patients get the exact medical supplies their care requires on time, on schedule, and on budget. This episode's a little bit different. Ethan sort of turned the tables and interviewed me. So, enjoy. Without further ado, Ethan Seville. All right, Ethan Seville, welcome back to the podcast, man.
Hey, thanks for having me again.
Always a pleasure. I think it's fun to be able to go back and sort of continue conversations and develop the relationships a little bit with people I have on. I love that opportunity. But for anyone who hasn't heard your previous episode and your appearance on the live stream, introduce yourself. Give us a little background.
Sure. My name's Ethan Seville. I'm a solutions architect at Slope, but my experience is deeply steeped in the research site world. I started as a research coordinator about 10 years ago, working in ophthalmology before moving into rare disease. But my background is pretty much every hat you can wear at the research site, from a phlebotomist to a lab tech to a regulatory person to a budget negotiator, kind of all the different hats that site personnel have to wear. So my role now is to take that site experience as well as my time at specialty CRO and turn it into a solution that works. At Slope, we pioneer site-first practices to ensure that sites are equipped, they have the supplies they need, they have the tools they need to keep track of all the chaos in research, as well as our sponsors too. But we really want to emphasize and elevate that site-first experience, and that's why I'm in the role I am now, is because of that site-based experience.
Yeah, I definitely have a soft spot for people who started out at the site level and can kind of sympathize, feel the pain of coordinators and other site personnel. And Slope's a really cool tool. I'll even put in a little plug. I know for us, we have so many lab kits spread across so many places. And that's something that Slope does a great job of helping sites keep organized. And I don't want to overspeak, but I'm pretty sure Slope is still free to sites. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, so again, it's a free tool to help you keep organized. Again, we moved a bunch of coordinators from one site to another and kind of integrated a couple of our clinics, and we're coming across expired lab kits that are really expired, and we need to have ordered more about 6 weeks ago. But
We weren't using slope, so we wouldn't have eyes on those things. So yeah, if you're a site, you handle a lot of product like that, I think slope's a really good choice. So very cool. Well, I think your pitch here was to do something a little bit different and sort of turn the tables a little bit and have some questions kind of at me, which I think, just help open up the conversation. So, man, fire away. Let's hear what you got.
Yeah. And one thing that I've always appreciated about your voice and your presence in professional social media and just research as a whole, even with this podcast, is your emphasis on the voice of the site. I've always appreciated that as a former coordinator and now a vendor person. I really, really love that sort of voice of the site, dialogue opener type of thing. But one thing that I was discussing with some of my colleagues is that we really just want to know more about your perspective, especially with Note to File, because we hear a lot of other voices on it, right? And it's a big resource for a lot of coordinators. In fact, a lot of people even come to Slope and say, hey, we heard you on Note to File. So it's getting a lot of attention, but there's a little more that I wanted to kind of dive into with you. Even just starting from your background, we joke a lot about coordinators, even like myself. I fell into the industry. I didn't intend to come into clinical research. Same goes for a lot of monitors, CRAs. But what about you? How did you end up in research, and specifically in the world of research sites?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I asked that question and with a lot of people is because I fell into. It was completely accidental and I guess sort of lucky, like a lot of us do, and sort of falling in love with it. But, it's sort of a tangled story, but I grew up in a very small town and went to college at the University of Oklahoma. First generation in my family to go to college. Really had no idea what the heck I was doing. Eventually decided, I was interested in, possibly a medical career of some kind. So I started working at a plasma center and obviously a college town. Plasma center is a pretty popular place. A lot of people are going to make a few extra bucks. So I started there. I became a really proficient phlebotomist and really enjoyed it. But then I ended up dropping out of college and I joined a band. I moved to Austin. I traveled. I played music for several years and eventually decided, okay, well, it's time to grow up. I was living in Seattle at the time. I moved back to Norman, Oklahoma, where the University of Oklahoma is. And I didn't really know what to do. So actually I got my job. I went back to the plasma center after being gone for several years. And I was just like, hey, you guys need a phlebotomist? They did. So, I jumped right back in and was a phlebotomist. I worked up into a center supervisor role. So I got to manage a lab and, do vital signs and, take, really kind of get a broad experience in working with patients as well as, labs and good documentation practices and things like that. But I kind of got to a point where I couldn't do anything else. I was only making $15 an hour, maybe. That kind of was capped out already. At the same time, my sister-in-law was leaving her job at the University of Oklahoma in a neurology department, and she was a research coordinator. So she was like, you've got some of the skills that would kind of match up. You should come check it out. Did. The interview went really well. I got along with the guys in the department. The only downside for me was I didn't have a degree. So at that point, that particular role was still required a bachelor's degree. I didn't even have an associate's. I had nothing. I dropped out and again, come back with, nothing to show for it. So they actually had to create a role that was even lesser than what had put out there. So it was like an entry level research assistant type role. And I'll be really honest, man, for the first year, I hated it. I had no idea what was going on. There was not really good training. There was no formal training. There was really nowhere to find good information that I was aware of. You had people back then like Dan Sfera creating content. I didn't know about him, at the time, but if you were to Google stuff, there was really nothing. There was nowhere to find anything. So, I figured it out, obviously, over the course of, 3 or 4 years. And then after I figured it out, I realized there's a whole world outside of academia, which I didn't know about. There are central IRBs. What is that? Certainly, you mean there's an IRB that doesn't take 9 months to get something approved? Like, what? Are you serious? So, I found, first of all, let's say Oklahoma City, not exactly the bastion of clinical research, but I did find a hospital that did clinical trials and they're looking for a manager. So I applied, got that job, eventually got promoted to a director position, but still realized like they're still not really doing it right either. None of these guys want to do trials. They just have to. They don't get paid for it. There's no organization. But I also learned, as hard as I tried, there was just no convincing them. So I had to break off on my own to do my own thing. So that's a little quick and high level, but just again, like everyone else, I fell in, and the way I came in really drives how I approach, the industry now. Like I felt terrible and I felt kind of like looked down upon because I didn't have a fancy degree, even though I was very capable. That's still an issue. I think a lot of people are still turned off because there's a lot of people there's people with MD after their names that are coordinators, and that's right. Much more respected oftentimes than somebody who doesn't have a degree, and even though they may be not as well suited for a position as someone without a degree. And on top of that, I still feel like there's not great information out there, which is why I've dedicated my whole, I guess, online presence to really just trying to magnify the site voice. And I've gone through a great deal of trouble not to I don't advertise my company on my podcast. I don't talk a lot about myself, and that's very purposeful and intentional as well, because again, I want these other voices, especially those at the site level or those speaking to the site level, to sort of take more importance. So, and as you see, you get me going on a rant and I end up in all kinds of end up all over the place. So
yeah, no, and it resonates a lot with me too, because I've had a similar perspective coming into the industry, but also seeing lots of people who come in without degrees, or maybe they have medical assistant certification, or they've worked as techs or MAs at a site that also does research, and inevitably kind of get pulled in by the gravity of it, maybe because it is the next potential step for career advancement, but because there's really no well-defined ladder, there's no career path, nor is there really solid pre-career training, you end up with this hodgepodge of people with all sorts of experiences, which I think is a wonderful thing in some ways, because you do get a lot of interesting perspectives and room to grow based on skill and experience and not just based on degree status. But at the same time, it's like, well, there could be some formality to this. It's not like you need a degree in clinical research to get a job in clinical research, because there really is none until you get to those one-off master's programs in research. But those are not people looking to start as a coordinator. Right.
So. Yeah, I consider it a blessing and a curse, or, it's a strength and a weakness. I know if I'm looking to hire people, I'm looking for people who were like me. I think that there's a lot of people out there with great potential who are capable of much more than what they're doing, but maybe don't know about the career path, or otherwise have been through things in their lives. They can't have master's degrees, but again, they're still perfectly capable. And to your point, you may have a more diverse and interesting background they can bring to the table than somebody who's, been a bench scientist or been sort of slaving away at, earning degrees to put letters after their name. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but
right. And it has its place too.
It does.
But you also have this kind of thing where it's like, well, you have someone who's got the actual skills and experience, like say to draw blood, right? Phlebotomy training is a huge thing for most coordinators, but unless you've gone to nursing school, you probably haven't picked up phlebotomy skills in college. So you have a bunch of qualified coordinators that need to go back to get a phlebotomy certification if they want to be able to advance in their actual career. It's a really, really interesting dynamic. So you've been with Hightower now. You've had Hightower for a while now. How many sites do you have, and about how many trials do you work on?
Yeah, I always kind of stumble on the sites question. It's complicated as sites begin to sort of, the definition of a site starts to change a little bit. But, I would say, we have 5 sites, but, for example, today I'm talking to you, I'm in a clinic that's within a hospital, and we work with 10, 15 different investigators here. So it's one site, but it's, multiple investigators across different therapeutic areas. I think we're running now close to 60 trials. Wow. Between enrolling and follow-up. And we're seeing a huge influx of new trial opportunities, especially in the oncology space. So we got really lucky to land a deal with a hospital system and a medical group that's really invested in growing a research program. And then obviously we still love to work with smaller independent practices as well. So it's kind of a hodgepodge of, we have one standalone site, we have a bunch of integrated clinics, and we have one sort of centralized hospital clinic as well. So again, I sometimes struggle because you could say how many sites versus how many doctors versus however you want to define it.
How many individual teams that all switch and move around depending on the needs of the study.
Right.
Yeah. And it's really interesting to see that because you have different studies that really prefer different things. You have some like those oncology studies that really need that hospital infrastructure with those dedicated teams with your full lab staff. And then you have others that really just want a small independent site with a PI that's there every day that's pulling from his own or her own patients. And you've got that whole dynamic that really makes those studies successful. So it's really cool that you've got a mix of both, and you can kind of offer the different practices, different indications, different expertises for the different needs of those studies.
Well, I think that's important, but also challenging about doing this is that it doesn't exactly scale like very easily, because again, I think success relies a lot on things that don't scale, which to your point is giving the doctor exactly what they need, the practice, as well as the sponsor or CRO. And that's variable between from study to study. And I don't know that it's always appreciated with a lot of nuance, but, the idea is that we can and want to be able to serve anyone who wants to participate in trials. And that looks very different depending on a number of things, even within the same system that looks very different sometimes.
Yeah. So thinking about all of that, you mentioned a little bit the difference between what the CRO and the sponsor are looking for versus what the site's looking for. And there's an interesting power play there and dynamic where everyone at the end of the day wants to run a successful study, but there's also just different needs and different incentives and therefore a different dynamic when you ask, what is a sponsor really looking for? They're looking for a site with well-trained staff that are capable of performing the study, but they're also looking to maybe stretch a budget and recruit from perhaps a more diverse population than they used to, but they don't necessarily have the infrastructure for it. So they're going outside of the norm, and you get all these really, really interesting dynamics. One thing that we've heard a lot, and there's a growing discussion around, is kind of the dynamic around an individual coordinator or how much sites get paid to actually conduct a study. There's this whole feeling that, once a coordinator gets to a certain point, they're inevitably going to move out and age out of that role and move into maybe a higher paying CRA role, or like me, for instance, jump into this vendor world where you have a whole other perspective. Is this a good thing, do you think? Is it a bad thing, part of the nature of the beast? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know that it's inherently good or bad. I think it's just the nature of the way things are because we've made them that way. I think when you look at, the way sites are compensated, and again, you're going to hear very few sites that say, we have all the money we need to do exactly what we want. You don't hear that a lot. And certainly as more private equity is getting into sites and site consolidation, maybe that is the case in some instances. But even a lot of these very large institutions lose money on their research programs. So as long as we continue with this model, I think it'll always be that way. And again, I have a very hard time blaming any research coordinator who sort of caps out where they are and says, you know what, I want to go travel. I want to get paid six figures. I want to open up a whole different level of career ladder. So, as a site, of course, it's very challenging and it can be disappointing and hard. And I do hear a lot of sites that struggle. They keep good help, but I think it's twofold. Other sites I've worked at have terrible culture. They just do. They tend to operate more or try to operate more like manufacturing, or I don't know. I just don't feel like they operate in a way that's good for the coordinators, being flexible, being a little more forward thinking and progressive in the way that they operate their business. But as someone who's trying to do that, I also know the struggle of, doing a lot of work that we don't get paid for at the site level. And, and as long as that's the case, it will be the case that coordinators will look outside as much as they can. Again, I tell people I would love to have a small committed group of coordinators that I can pay very well, and we all work together very hard, but they're very well taken care of and compensated. I think that's doable, but we're chasing down study startups that have been, invoiced 9 months ago. That you can't run a business very long that way and retain good talent. So Is it good or bad? I don't know. It just depends on your situation. I intentionally wanted to stay at sites and at the site level because I feel like there's a lot of work to be done. And even though it's challenging, there's still a lot of opportunity there. So it'll continue to be a problem until sites are, sort of more well taken care of. And I think, we need to acknowledge that most of this stuff doesn't work without sites. It just doesn't. DCT, of course, is a thing and it's appropriate in some instances. But for the overwhelming majority of trials, you need good sites. And, we're only going to shoot ourselves in the foot if we're short-sighted about how we're compensating sites.
Yeah. And you summed it up nicely. And I think it's a testament to just how a good site functions when you are able to keep staff and keep coordinators happy. I've worked at a number of different sites of different dynamics, and, culture is king. Even at Slope, outside of the site world, it's kind of not unique to research. That goes with anywhere. But it's really, really a positive thing when you do have that team that works really well together, and you have coordinators that are able to shift context and be suddenly salespeople, right? And sell to sponsors and sell your site. And at the same time, go do a really difficult stick and then go process some blood and then become a data manager overnight. Like all those different types of soft skills and hard skills come together to make a really, really powerful dynamic that just can't really be replaced. So it's great when you do get that team, it gels and you end up having this really, really cohesive group together.
Well, I think, to your point, like the coordinator is really like the ultimate jack of all trades. I mean, and to me, that's what I found so rewarding and what keeps me excited about doing it. Even now, I'm still drawing blood and seeing patients on top of, taking care of payroll and doing business development and having a hand in, regulatory submissions and all those different things. But to that, that's hard to ask of people if you can only afford to pay them, $35,000 a year and ask them to do everything.
Right.
Again, it's only sustainable for so long. And especially if you're not providing a really compelling work environment, for them to be a part of. So again, I think you'll always see sites struggle with that unless something changes, which I very seriously doubt. Much as, I consider myself an optimist, I very seriously doubt there's going to be any fast, widespread change in how sites are sort of taken care of.
Yeah. Well, and then going back to something you mentioned a little earlier with, the advent of DCT elements coming into the industry and changing at least the conversation around trials. Whether or not they're changing the trials themselves is another question. But a lot of that voice was amplified during COVID. But what do you think, having, over a decade at the site level, what has actually changed? Have there been any big permanent changes out of COVID or not? What have we gone back to?
Yeah, I mean, I loved seeing like never go back hashtags and things like that. But I mean, for better or worse, I think we've gone almost entirely back to the way things were. Now, obviously, that's not the case across the board, but I feel like as soon as monitors could come back on site, they were back on site. And as soon as we could kind of go back to business as usual, we have. I think we are seeing things that make sense, whether it be COVID or not, e-regulatory. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. We should be sharing and storing those documents electronically. There's no reason to have huge binders stacked up in your office. E-source to some degree, still not really probably as broadly utilized as it should be. But I really don't see any more, or at least not a lot of remote monitor visits at scale. It's kind of gone away. We don't ship anything direct to patient. E-consent is still a really mixed bag. I think, again, it's intuitive and makes sense, but I feel like we still haven't really gotten widespread adoption of that either. I know we're seeing home health implemented into a lot of trials, but I think generally speaking, if you're a site and you can get somebody on site, you're going to do that unless there's just other, extenuating circumstances in which you can't. So adoption hasn't remained as high as probably people hoped it would, but I guess that's still a work in progress at this point.
Yeah. And you mentioned things like home health aspects where it's like, some of those existed plenty pre-COVID, and things like rare disease where you had issues with access to sites. And it's like, yeah, that's still a place where that is needed and is relevant, and is probably where that's going to stay for a long time, is, questions of access and retention, not so much is this going to help my struggling phase 3 study recruit another 20,000 patients? Probably not.
Right. Right.
That those questions still remain like, well, how do we really increase diversity across a broad population? Is it things like home health? Maybe not so much. Is it things like getting more neighborhood investigators into research? Probably. Those are the types of things, which kind of brings us back to how do you make research more sustainable for individual sites and individual investigators with things like permanent infrastructure that makes it just work better. Let the professionals do their job really, really, really well.
I love that point, and I think it's been sort of overlooked. Like, why haven't we, sites know what they're doing, right? Why haven't we really tapped on their shoulders first to be like, hey, what do we do here? The people who are actually on the ground, seeing the patients, hearing from them every day, taking their phone calls every day. What are we seeing that what would work, instead of like, oh, well, let's just jump over the whole thing and try to start, quote unquote, decentralized. And again, maybe that's not, it's not an either or. It doesn't have to be either or. It's not a zero sum game. There's certainly a mix that makes sense, but I also think it's just frustrating for site people, at least people like me, to go on LinkedIn and read about decentralized trials, and you would think, oh, well, it's cure-all and it's fixing everything and everything's going to be decentralized, when that's just not the case. It just doesn't make sense for still an overwhelming majority of trials. But again, it is what it is. We're still learning, right?
Yep. Yeah, it's all a learning process from sponsors' standpoint, the CROs, how they implement studies, and even the sites. To that end, we kind of always joke about the dynamic between sites, sponsors, and CROs. It's a little odd, but can you get into what you think the somewhat challenging relationship that exists between those three players? What do you think is like the big challenge that keeps everyone from being truly collaborative?
I think it is just communication and sort of, I've used the word siloed a lot throughout the last couple of years as I've been talking to people. And I still feel like that's really the kind of the crux of it, right? And in instances where, I've got a nice line of communication from both CRO and sponsor, and we're all sort of hearing each other's challenges together, we can effectively problem solve. Now, again, I don't know if it's just, everyone's overworked and everyone's siloed. So it's just a lot to ask to get that. And it's not a matter of, intention. We're doing it intentionally. It's just a matter of being too busy or not really focusing in on it. Because it's tough, right? It's sort of like this vague idea of like, well, we just need to communicate better. Because, it's for better or worse, it's not a science. It's like more of an art, kind of getting it right. So yeah, I really think, again, a lot of it can be solved with open communication and also just understanding, right? Like, you've had CRAs come on site and just tear you up, like, for no good reason, right? Like, look, man, I'm doing my best. We're all in this together. Let's be collaborative. You're not here to get me in trouble. I'm not here to argue with you over every little thing. Let's just work as a team. Let's partner. And sometimes it's as simple as that, right? That's not rocket science. That's very simple. And look, just we talked about it, but just pay me on time. Again, that's also so small, but so important.
Yeah.
I had a sponsor call me, one that we've done a lot of good work with, and they said, there's some other companies that are kind of getting into our space. How can we be a sponsor that, sort of takes priority over some of these others? And that's the first thing I said, just pay your sites on time. Pay them every month and pay them on time. It's as simple as that. If you do that, you're already going to be light years ahead of the competition in most instances.
It's amazing how those simple things that, we just expect with normal business relationships can really make a world of a difference in research. I think it kind of just underscores the fact that there's a lot in this groundbreaking field that's really kind of just hodgepodge and just, hey, we're all trying our best, but probably the person who's responsible for site payments has like 40 other things that they're trying to do too. And so of course things get thrown by the wayside. But it all comes down to even what you're describing with that sponsor is this rush to really try and fix it, right? You want to hope and believe that really everyone does want to make this better and work for everyone. We hear a lot of that, in our interactions with sponsors where they're like, hey, we really want to make sure our site's like this. And we have an interesting perspective at Slope too, because we started as a site-first solution. Our first product was exclusively for sites. So we have a bit of an edge there because we have a lot of site users. We have plenty of feedback from sites that help us keep that. But from the sponsor's perspective, they're not necessarily used to that. We get the site first term thrown around, but there's not a whole lot to back it up. But as a site person primarily, what would you define as being like a true site first solution or practice or what have you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think just generally allowing the sites some berth to use their solutions if they're safe and meet regulatory requirements, I guess would be a very broad way to say it, right? So if I, as a site, want to do something, it doesn't break any rules and it's safe, you should allow me to do that. Don't try to dictate every little thing that happens. Let sites have that leeway to do so. And it's something I've been very disappointed by some sponsors because, even talking about, you mentioned the idea of, working with treating physician offices in other communities that maybe aren't my site, but, we can do some remote visits, we can do telehealth, we can do sort of our own spin on decentralized, and it's been shot down. Or like they have a home health, on staff, but like, look, we can do that as a site. We can offer that. We're partnered with the home health. Let us bring that to the table. Again, only to be sort of shot down when we feel like that could make everyone's lives easier. We could enroll faster. We're working with people we already know and trust. It makes more financial sense for us. It all adds up. And again, it doesn't always have to be, something quite so involved. But again, allowing sites to bring their solutions to the table and be heard. I understand you're not going to let every site do every little thing they want because it gets messy, but still be willing to at least entertain it if it makes sense, Yeah. And again, a lot of that is that sites don't even get that level of input anywhere. There's no place that they're asked, what would you bring to the table? What do you have that, you might be able to contribute that would make enrollment better or, increase retention? So, I mean, maybe start there. Just ask the sites, what do you got? What can you do?
Yeah, that's you raise a couple of really good points there. One about like the home health scenario where a sponsor might want to bring home health to the table. They've probably invested a serious chunk of change into that, but the site might already have some sort of solution or some option for it. And instead of being synergistic there, you've got, hey, if you're going to do this, you got to do it our way, which probably leads to gaps in oversight where your PI is no longer really able to actually oversee that patient because it's moved somewhere else, and the sponsor's like, it's okay, we got it, but the PI doesn't feel comfortable with it, and you end up with no home health or no increased access instead of what could have been a really, really great opportunity and probably a lot of wasted money in that whole scenario. And you extend that to everything from what you mentioned before with eReg. What if a site invests a lot of money in their own eReg platform, and then a sponsor comes along and says, hey, for this study, we're using this eReg platform, and suddenly we have 2 eReg platforms, and multiply that by however many studies you're working on. And now why does it make sense for a site to invest in an eReg platform in the first place if they're just going to have to log out of that and log into another every time they've got a new study?
Yeah, no, and that puts us in a very weird conundrum as a site, because you're like, well, should I invest in anything? Because I'm going to get told what to do every time. Now, I will say eReg is a good example where I'm seeing sponsors be very open to what sites are bringing to the table. So I'm very encouraged by that. There was a time when even I was a little scared to pull the trigger on going too far, because what you're going to have is just, we're using this or whatever the case may be. And you're like, well, crap, then why did I ever bother in the first place?
Right.
But, home health is a really interesting one because potentially, otherwise the site may not use your home health period at all. And if that's the alternative, then why not let them use a partner that they already have? Because I think what you're describing is still not clear. Who are these people?
Right.
I'm still, as a PI, I'm saying I'm still ultimately responsible. I don't know what they're doing in their home. I don't know that I trust, I have to delegate them. I'm basically putting my name on the line saying that, I trust that they're properly trained and know what they're doing. And, again, you can't dictate that for the PI, but it's being done all the time.
Yeah, no, it ends up being really, really challenging, and you end up with a lot of wasted time and money and energy for it. Kind of looping back to how sites can invest in themselves and make themselves more equipped, but kind of balance that dynamic with the sponsors. One of the reasons why Slope actually made our site solution free is because we didn't want sites to have to make that choice and worry about making an investment that would then suddenly be made irrelevant because the sponsor strong-armed them. And it's been a really, really important way for us to grow, is just by giving sites tools to do what they need to do. But it makes me think of some of the feedback we've heard from sites, which is when the sponsors do ask, hey, how can we do this better? Say a site volunteers it. The only time we've ever heard that be a thing is like at, say, an investigators meeting at the beginning of a study, after all the solutions have already been set. So there's a lot of, hey, that sounds like a great idea. We'll get back to you next time. And that kind of conversation continues and continues and continues. And there's just always this, oh, it's too late. Next time we'll get to it. And I think you raise a really important point, that just elevating that site voice before any individual project, or just in general, having a better dialogue around site needs and site burdens is just so important. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about you and your podcast and your voice on LinkedIn, is it gets conversations going so that more people even just understand what's going on at the site in the first place.
Yeah, well, and look, that's just it. I'll be the first to tell people I don't have the answers for a lot of stuff. I really don't, even though I may confidently seem like I do at times, or I may, talk like I do. I'm the first to admit I do not have the answer to a lot of these problems, but there's a whole lot of people out there way smarter than me. So if we can at least get the conversation going and we can start to get feedback, I mean, the whole point was just to sort of democratize the conversation, because I feel like it hasn't been that way. Again, we've sort of just been told at the site level, like, oh, well, this is what's happening and this is how it is. And even until a few years ago, I'm coming up on 15 years, but it took 10 before I was like, hey, wait a minute. I have an actual voice here. I don't have to just lay down and do everything that's asked of me. So yeah, I mean, again, that's been my whole mission at this point, is just have the conversations. And sometimes, that does come off as complainy, or it comes off as acting like a know-it-all, or unnecessarily being, sort of snotty towards other, research groups or interests. But ultimately, we all want the same thing. If I wanted to make a whole bunch of money, I'd be in a different industry. I'm doing this because I believe in what we do very, very strongly, and I love it. So, I want to help make a positive change, even if it makes me look like a jerk in the process.
Well, I think it's really important too. And you mentioned even earlier, starting out in research, not really having resources for just learning anything. And, things like the clinical trials guru with Dan Fair is that's a really common thing that people come across just because of the lack of really good resources. I remember even when I started, my first manager was like, hey, here's some books that we bought for an ACRP training course years ago. And it's that's what we have. And it's right. I can get a little bit from that, but it's really not going to tell me much about the actual research coordinator experience.
It's not practical. It's great. I love ACRP. I love SOCRA. I love all those groups. But a lot of times, it lacks any okay, well, how do I make a source document?
Right.
Or how do I do some of these things? Yeah, no, I'm with you there.
So it's really, really cool to see that kind of change and hear people and see people's comments on LinkedIn, even just the presence of research coordinators as a population on LinkedIn talking about things, sharing their solutions, sharing the things that made them successful. It's the only way we're going to improve.
Well, yeah, that's just it. I think, again, I wasn't open to the world for a long time, and I'm happy to see that people are out there. I mean, because I do think we owe it to ourselves to, we have to be like some of these other startups. We got to go try new things. We got to see what works, which means we have to be willing to take some risks a little bit sometimes as research sites. And I mean that as, obviously we're not risking health and safety. We're not risking, breaking any regulatory rules, but we have to also be willing to put ourselves out there, try new things. But you're not going to get that unless people know about them and, have access to them. So again, it's just a matter of getting it out there so that we can all agree oh, you know what? This approach or this software, it sucks. We don't like it. Yep. This one is great. So let's use that one. Why aren't we doing things more like that? And hopefully that, even if it's not super apparent, that's still shaping some things in the background in the industry. And I've seen that already in conversations I've had is, people are listening and they're watching, Yep. And so this is why we need to keep having these conversations publicly, even if they're, sometimes painful.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned this solution works, this solution doesn't. One thing we hear all the time is that sites are worn out when it comes to new vendors, new solutions, new logins. There are just too many of them, which I wholeheartedly agree and endorse as someone who works for one of these solutions. But a lot of them claim to be like, oh, but we're different. We're truly site-centric. We're the ones that the sites actually like. But what's been your experience? What do you think makes the difference between a solution that works for sites and one that sites have to work to use?
Yeah, so I'm coming a little bit more to the center on this issue, I think, because, and I've said this recently, is that like, look, for better or worse, we're going to have a lot of systems. And as sites, we sort of have to accept it. I'm willing to accept that because, again, I think we're still trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. I've even found on like the business side or business development or whatever the case is, like I want to try a bunch of different systems out to see what works for me. And that's okay, right? We know that, look, some of it's going to be wasted time. I mean, none of it's wasted time if you're learning, but to some degree, we have to come to terms with that at the site level and say, hey, look, these are all people trying to do their best. But I think it's more, again, like, okay, let's start paring down or let's start talking like, look, we can all agree this solution is not good. Now, what kind of leverage can we have as sites to say, like, look, get rid of it, stop using it, let's use something else. So that's kind of where I think, sites need to be vocal with sponsors. Like, look, I don't like using blank EDC. Please stop buying their stuff until they change. It's either going to result in the stuff nobody likes going away or them evolving to work better. But I think sponsors have to be willing to take that feedback. So to some degree, I sort of accept the fact that, first, the value proposition has to be clear to a site, right? Not like, get in the system and do some stuff and, maybe it'll help your workflow or maybe it won't. It needs to be apparent that it will. And then the company or vendor needs to be willing to actually listen to the site and take that feedback. And again, I think it's getting better on the whole. I think you still got a bunch of legacy systems out there that need to just go away. But they've got a lot of money sort of thrown at them. Like maybe there's some like sunk cost stuff going on there. Mm-hmm. But eventually, it's not hard to find if you read into my LinkedIn, but there's some out there that just need to go. They just need to go away. There's no point in trying to fix them. Great idea. Let's take the idea and let's make something that actually works.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. And even back, it's been a few years since I've been at the site, but we had some systems that genuinely, like the training materials had screenshots from 97 in them. And it's right. Like, I can tell that this was not updated anytime in the last 2 decades and right. We're still working with it. And there's a degree of that. And then, kind of in the less extreme, there's a lot of systems that just kind of feel like they were designed for someone else, right? And repurposed. I think for me personally, I've seen like there's a lot of importance for vendors to take ownership of the site experience and just say, hey, listen, I get this. I understand that this is new for you and it might be really good or it might suck. And we need to make sure that it's the first, right? We need to make sure that we make this work for you and not just an imaginary ideal coordinator who has all the time in the world to work with the system.
Well, and something else that wasn't always clear to me is that, and that's something I think vendors should be willing to do, is tell their clients, no, we're not going to do that because it waters down their product. So sometimes there's a vendor that's perfectly good. Their product is great, but they're getting requests from their, sponsor to do things that are completely stupid and ruin it. And then I'm standing back saying, well, hey, this EDC is terrible. Well, maybe it's not. Maybe it's great. But instead, they're trying too hard to, listen to their customer and they made it garbage, if that makes sense. That's sort of a weird way to say it. But yeah, I've heard this from vendors where I'm like, I'll talk to them and be like, hey, why did you do this? This was a dumb thing. Like, well, the company we're working with wanted it.
Yep.
I ran across one day and they said the sponsor wanted it and we did it, but now we've learned to say no because it actually makes it worse and it's only slightly more convenient for them. And I love that. Again, be smart. Don't water down your product just because, I don't know, maybe it's, a few extra bucks. Maybe people are scared of losing out on the business customizing things. But again, I think that's something that's not always clear, but reflects very poorly on some of these vendors when it's not even, maybe not really their fault.
Yeah. And it, as coming from someone who does hear that, it's like you get a lot of requests because there are a lot of problems to solve. And that's the thing. Everyone's trying to solve the problems. And I think going back to one of our earlier topics, there are a ton of systems out there. So it just makes sense where it's like, hey, as a sponsor, I would love it if you could do these 2 things because I right now have to use 2 different vendors to do this. And I would really like to just do one. And there's a point where like, hey, does this make sense? Let's entertain it. But if the answer is no, then let's let the people who are really good at randomization and that part do that part. And let's let the great EDCs do great EDC work. And our great eRegs do that really, really, really well. And is there room for alignment and integration? Yeah, absolutely. And if we can remove site burden, let's figure out how to do it. But if trying to make something become all things to all people is just going to dilute it and make it worse and end up adding in another system later on down the road, suddenly we've just gone against everything we wanted to do in the first place.
Right. Well, and I guess, if it's not yet, it will be. The big chance going to be interoperability, right? And like sort of stitching everything together in a way that makes sense. So obviously we're not there. But eventually, like, again, don't just make, if you're just setting out to make another EDC, don't do that. We got them. Go make another one. But, again, I've kind of come around. I've complained less, I think, about all the systems because, like, look, coordinators aren't idiots. We can log into systems. It's not that hard. Everyone's got LastPass or, some kind of password storage. It's not the end of the world. Anyone halfway computer savvy can log into a system. But the fact of, they're not connected in any meaningful way, or like you have to like, it's like putting together a puzzle every time you want to enroll a patient because, I got to go here, but then here, but then here. Oh, no. I got to go here first and put the subject number in here. Like, at least give me that. Show me the flow.
Right.
Again, it's not that I have to log into 3. It's that which one talks to which and which one do I go to first and what the hell's going on here? Just give me something here.
and will I break it when I enter the wrong subject number in here that was automatically generated by another system? Right. And then you got the problem where the interoperability then becomes the burden when you just aren't equipped as a coordinator to understand that data flow. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I think, I don't know about you, but I see it as huge potential. I tend to be more of an optimist if it's not always the most realistic point of mine, but it's more fun. But it's like there's so much potential here. You have so many talented people at research sites, at vendors, at CROs, at sponsors, some of the like most skilled people I've ever worked with in this industry. So it's like if we can all get on the same page and grow in the same direction, there's no telling what we can do.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And again, I do think it's getting better. We're seeing, more working groups, and we're seeing more vendors having site councils or whatever you want to call them, and actually, taking those things into consideration. I think we just need to continue bringing everybody together. And also, again, just don't be afraid to call out what's not working. It's okay. Look, if you want to know what's working, just open LinkedIn. Everyone will tell you how great they are. I get it. There's a lot of self-congratulations, a lot of patting on the back, and that's okay. There's definitely a place for that. But, at the same token, don't be afraid to say what's not working, and I think that's oftentimes just undervalued or sort of poo-pooed because, we don't want to be negative. But again, how else will we solve the problems without calling them out as they are,
Right.
But to your point, I know I don't always come across as an optimist, but I really am. I also retain a little bit of cynicism at times, and that's okay too. But we need that. I think.
Clicks.
What's that?
I said it gets clicks, it gets eyeballs.
Well, I don't even really. Look, if I get 1 million clicks or none, it doesn't really help me. I don't earn more business from getting clicks. Like, if anything, it just puts me at more risk of people getting mad and not wanting to work with me. So, if I get all the likes in the world, that doesn't put more patients in my studies, and it sure as hell doesn't give me more study opportunities. So, it's not for that, but.
Right. But it does serve as an important part of the dialogue to help change things. So I think it's an important thing to underscore just the whole conversation is everyone benefits when we talk, right? Everyone benefits when these conversations, even the tough ones, are had, because if we don't talk about it, it's not going to change, and the issues will only compound. And at the end of the day, the people who bear the burden are the patients that can't get into the trials, and those trials that fail because of a lack of infrastructure or overburdensome infrastructure. We'll all still have our jobs. The industry will keep turning. There'll still be investment, but the patients who are not able to benefit from this hard work, they're the ones who bear the burden.
Well, and even when it is successful, we could be shaving all kinds of time and money off so that when these things do come out, they're more affordable and more accessible, Yeah. So again, regardless, I mean, that is the whole point, right? I mean, we can't do research by ourselves. We need the patient, and
Yep.
it's got to make sense for them. But all the little things that trickle down or along the way are, again, ridiculously important. And, again, to your point, I just want to have the conversations. And in fairness, sometimes the easiest way to spark the conversation is just by setting a little fire and then backing away from it and watching it turn into more of a fire. But I think it beats the alternative of everybody just shaking each other's hands and saying how great everything is, So it'll be a long and arduous journey, but I'm confident that we'll continue to get there as an industry.
Absolutely. Well, awesome. This has been great. Do you have anything else you want to add for any new coordinators, any experienced coordinators? What's your takeaway?
Man, here's what I would say is jump into the fray. Don't be afraid to look stupid. I spent my first couple of years afraid. I think it really hinders your ability to learn. Now, I know that's easier said than done. I worked in an academic department. I had a chair who was just waiting for a coordinator to say something stupid so that they could rip him apart and make them, feel dumber than they already felt. But, I would say go online, go on LinkedIn, find some conversations to be a part of, ask questions. Don't be afraid to look stupid. Again, that's maybe the biggest thing is I don't know, the cheesy saying is looking stupid is the first step towards being a master at something or something along those lines, right? But you got to get over that hump. You got to take that first step. And look, I'm still out there making myself look stupid sometimes, and that's okay. I've become comfortable with that because ultimately it leads to me learning, and hopefully it's leading to a bunch of other people learning too along the way by, watching me make a fool out of myself occasionally. So yeah, go out there, find some people to learn from, ask dumb questions. I think that's the only way we're going to continue to sort of, trod forward. So just go for it. Don't be afraid.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Brad. I really enjoyed getting to come back on Note to File and chat with you.
Well, thanks for making me really have to think and talk more than I usually do. And as always, I want to know, how can people find you online?
So you can find us on LinkedIn, just Slope. Our website is slopeclinical.com. So you can find more about our solution. We work for sites and for sponsors too. We're always happy to talk and see how we can help you with your sample management, lab kits, or any other complex clinical trial infrastructure problem.
Yeah, and in transparency, we've worked a little bit with Slope. I have not gotten it implemented on our sites, but I do think it's an amazing feature and option for sites to use. And I really don't know anyone else doing what Slope is doing, which is also pretty cool. It's really novel, right? And I think it can be extremely useful for sites. So definitely do check them out, and I'll make sure to put their info on our show notes. And man, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to rant, and I'm sure we'll do this again before too long. So thanks, Ethan.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad.
As always, thank you guys so much for listening. Make sure to check us out at notetofilepodcast.com. Check out our past guests, as well as our contact information, show notes, and episode transcripts. If you haven't heard by now, also make sure to check out saveoursites.com for upcoming information about a new conference hitting the industry. Thanks, guys.